Hello, and welcome to Master's Thesis 2024, Qualitative Methods. I'm Lynne Bowman. I'm a senior lecturer at Uppsala University, and I will be with you today talking about these methodological approaches. So, qualitative methods means gathering data that is not necessarily numerical. And it can be roughly divided into three categories. One is very common, especially in games, studies that involve human subjects. And I said before in an earlier interview that we often think about people as quote unquote objects of study. And by calling them human subjects, it's a way of reminding us that they're actually people and they have their own subjectivity. And there's a certain amount of ethical consideration that needs to be taken into account when engaging in these kinds of studies, which we'll talk about in a bit. But anyway, any work that involves taking data from people as part of the research or revealing data about a person that was previously unavailable, maybe it was behind, some sort of vault or something, is a human subjects research. Then there's studies in which the human subject is yourself and your own observations without identifying details about other people, emphasizing your own experience within, let's say, a subculture or a gaming group or playing a particular game. And then there's studies that analyze existing data that is open to the public in some way, or perhaps it exists in a public forum. So this could be books about game design. It could be forum posts. It could be GDC talks. It could be any number of types of quote unquote texts that can be used as data. So for example, you can analyze behavior in an online environment that's open to the public. You can interpret the game as itself as textual material to be analyzed. You can look at blog, forum, or social media posts that are openly available. So if it's behind some sort of like privacy setting, then that doesn't count. So if it's a private Facebook group, for example, that wouldn't count. But anything that anybody could access is fair game for analysis. And then you could analyze interviews or other public statements from game developers as an example. So there's lots and lots of different things that fall under this. These are just giving you an idea of the different kinds of qualitative research that's out there. Okay, so looking at human subjects, so taking data from people as part of the research. This should include some sort of signed consent form, even for the thesis. Now, it's not a requirement in the same way that it is when you are a PhD student or a researcher that has a PhD in Sweden. However, we strongly recommend that you have a consent form and that your participants sign it. This consent form should explain the purpose of the study, how their data will be stored, who has access to it, for how long, and who is supervising the project within the university, or it could be some other form of authority. So you may put the department chair's name there, you may put my name, or in some cases, there may be some other authority. And in this case, if you had ethics review approval, for example, maybe you put the name of the case on there and also some information about the ethics board if they're to contact them. The point is that you're creating some sort of accountability structure. This research isn't happening in a vacuum. It's not just, your data isn't just going anywhere. You are letting people know where their data is going and who has access to it. We'd really prefer that you not have any kinds of studies that involve deceit, unless it's absolutely impossible to answer the research questions otherwise. That is such a very rare occurrence. Generally, if you're involving deceit, not only does it involve ethical concerns, but it also can make the participants lose trust in you and even in the university. So it's just not recommended. And you should aim to present the participants in a fair light in your work, even if their opinions differ from your own. And this can be very difficult, especially if they're espousing beliefs that you don't agree with. But the idea behind this research is not to get people to reveal a bunch of personal information and then to put that on blast for the rest of the world to see and embarrass them, right? You really want to sort of protect your subjects because they are trusting you with very personal information. Even if you're just doing a very basic interview that doesn't seem to have any controversial topics, what you might find is people will self-disclose these things in the interview. So all of a sudden, it might become a very sensitive interview. We'll talk about sensitive data in a second. So as I mentioned, human subjects usually involves collecting sensitive data. So there may be times when that wasn't even the purpose. Maybe you were just curious about, how much a student particularly enjoys school. And all of a sudden they're telling you about, a time that they had a teacher abuse them or something like that. And that becomes sensitive data all of a sudden. But the general categories that are sort of legally implied by sensitive data are information about racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, any kind of membership in a trade union, health, a person's sex life or their sexual orientation. That can also include gender, in my opinion. Genetic data and biometric data that is being used to uniquely identify a person. So you can take biometric data that isn't connected to any particular person, but if they can be identified from it, then that's sensitive data. So this kind of information sometimes requires ethical approval by a board of experts, or at least ethical review, and then it might get sent back and they tell you, oh, this only requires minimal review or is exempt. Now, in Sweden, as a student, you don't have to get ethical approval as a master's student, but you do have to delete the data afterwards. So the minute that you finish your thesis, you're supposed to delete all of that data, and you cannot publish it elsewhere. So if you're planning on doing several studies based on this research, then you really need to get ethical approval first. And that can be a costly and time-consuming process. So that being said, you do have the option of publishing in DIVA, which is a publication. So you will be able to share your work with the world. It's just a special rule about who is considered a researcher and who isn't. But, stepping away from the rules and really trying to think about the logic behind them and the intention behind them, I think most of us would be very uncomfortable if really personal things were put that out there on the internet without our consent, or in some sort of identifiable way. And so as a researcher, you really have an ethical responsibility towards your subjects. I like to call them participants. So human subjects, like I said, usually involves collecting sensitive data, and this data must be handled ethically. So one way to do that is to what's called in Sweden pseudo-anonymize the data. The reason it's called pseudo-anonymizing the data is that you can't fully anonymize qualitative data. There may be parts that are identifiable in particular ways, maybe by people who are close friends to the person you interviewed and happen to know that they were one of the interviewees. There's all sorts of ways that people can pick out certain details. But you're going to try your best to remove any identifying features. This is for the actual stuff you're putting in your results section, not necessarily the transcript. That's private. And you're going to assign a pseudonym or an alphanumeric code to the participant, unless they give you explicit permission to use their name, which is not the norm. Consider which data should be paraphrased in the thesis, made less specific to one person. So you could say, instead of talking about one person's very personal, journey with depression, you could instead say, some participants stated, mental health concerns. And, that, especially if multiple people mention mental health concerns, you can sort of make it less identifiable that way. And especially you want to anonymize any quotes that you put in the paper. And you might just want to not involve certain data at all. So if it's particularly sensitive, if it's particularly revealing or stigmatizing, it might not be worth putting in the paper. So consider the impacts on your participants beyond your study. This can include stigma, financial repercussions. That can even be, in some cases, disowned from their families for certain information. So, yeah. Personal data is also often collected by us, and this is identifying data. At this point, I'm sure you're familiar with GDPR, but it's worth going through the rules and storing data responsibly according to GDPR rules. You can put them on encrypted shared drives hosted in the EU, for example. You can keep them only on your personal device and not uploaded to a cloud. That's a particularly safe way. Or put them on an external hard drive so you have multiple copies. But the important thing is that other people shouldn't have access to this data. You must not share the data set with anyone other than the members of your project. The only exception might be the supervisor or examiner, depending on the situation. This is very unusual, but let's say your examiner wants to see the data for some reason. But for the most part, it's just going to be your people on your team looking at it. And you must delete all data after the study is complete, as I mentioned, because without ethical review, you cannot use it in future publications. Okay, so let's move on from the sort of darker side of qualitative data collection and talk about what kinds of qualitative data you can gather. So there's field notes. This is when you take observational notes while you're quote unquote in the field. This term comes from like anthropology, when anthropologists would go out literally in a field usually and study what people are doing out there. But here the field could be, an online environment. But regardless, if you're in the field, you're embedded within the group or the activity in some way, either as a participant or as an observer or as both. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So it might just be field notes. That might be the majority of your data collection. It might also be feedback from your participants about how your game went. That might fall into this category. Although, honestly, we recommend audio recording if you have consent. So when you're taking interview data, recording it in some way that it's not just taking notes, for example. That being said, if your participants are not comfortable with the audio recording, it's best to find another way. You could also do video recording, which some people are even more intimidated by. And so you could analyze people's behavior on the screen after the fact. So this is one of those things that, going back to data collection, needs strong consent and data handling procedures around it. So don't just film things definitely don't film things without the consent or awareness of your participants. And also think about how you're keeping that information very secure. But one type of method that I find super interesting that's related to video recording is called stimulated recall. And this is when you play back the video to the participant and you ask what they were thinking or feeling at a given moment. And this is similar to reality TV confessionals, for example. People aren't reacting in real time. They're reacting to something that was stimulated, and then they're recalling as a result, even if they're talking in the present tense. So working with transcripts. So once you have your interview data, you need to create a transcript from it. So whenever you're integrating a quotation, for example, some researchers will keep in all the ums and pauses, as well as any laughter or crying or body language. They may put that in brackets, what's happening. This is very common when studying the sociolinguistics of a person's speech. So thinking about why someone might have paused at a specific time, or why a certain comment might have been conceived of as funny, or are they being sarcastic here, or just like really interpreting into a lot of those things. Then there's people like me who delete most of them, mostly because I really want the voice of the participant to be best received by the audience. And if there's a lot of, even in my speech now, I use a lot of ums accidentally. If there's a lot of that in a transcript, it can be difficult to read and people might actually stop reading. So, yeah. You can also add extra words into your quotations as needed. So you're not changing what they're saying, but you're indicating that you've inserted something. And you can do that by putting some words in brackets. For example, if someone said, I loved it when I first played it, and they're referring very clearly to a game that you were talking about earlier in the interview, you can put, I loved brackets the game, or I loved brackets Dragon Age, or whatever it is when I first played it, just to help the reader understand what's being referred to here. However, do not twist their words or overly change the meaning of the text. If you need to delete part of a quote, you can use ellipses. So I loved it, ... It was my favorite game. Maybe in there it said, I loved it. Oh, wait, my dog needs to go out. Okay, I'm back. Okay, it was my favorite game. You don't need to include all of that stuff, right? That's much easier to read with the ellipsis. Okay, so that was about working with transcripts, but let's think about some types of qualitative data that you can gather. So there's open answer questions on a quantitative survey. So perhaps you're asking a bunch of, rate on a scale from 1 to 5, your experience of the game or whatever. So quantitative measurements. And then you have another box that says, in your own words, you can describe what your experience was like. And then all of a sudden, you're actually taking qualitative data in addition. That's what we would call a mixed method study, where there's both happening. Or you can do different kinds of interviews. The first is a structured interview. That means it's very precise about exactly what happens when. And the questions are usually asked, the same questions are asked in the same order to each person. And that's to have a fairly consistent, experience across the participant base. Then there's semi-structured interviews. And this is what I tend to do, although I've done structured interviews as well. And this is interviews where the researcher uses the initial questions just as a jumping off point. So maybe they don't even get to certain questions and they're focusing on other questions, and they're asking follow-up questions and leading the conversation and letting it go wherever it wants to go in a more organic fashion. And that can be really interesting. It can lead you into some great places, but it also tends to mean that you might get off track from what you were trying to study. So you have to be careful and make sure that you do hit those initial research questions. Interviews can take place in person, online asynchronously, so over email, for example, or synchronously, so over Zoom like this, or on a chat, for example, in real time. And that will, whatever you choose, will lend to a different type of transcript. Okay. So ethnography. Simply doing an interview doesn't necessarily mean it's an ethnography. An interview is asking people questions about their experience, whereas an ethnography implies that you're somehow engaged in that community, which you may very well be, in which case a lot of you may actually be doing ethnography in this study. So if you're engaging in a specific subculture that's related to a certain type of game or a certain game itself, and this refers to a certain amount of embeddedness. So I study analog role-playing games, for example, and it's very different to talk to someone who actually plays these games, who's a researcher, versus someone who's looking at them from the outside. In fact, I think it's almost impossible to do good research on role-playing games if you haven't done at least some of the actual practice of it. Then again, there are some people that think that that might lead to less objectivity if you're too involved in the subculture. So that's something to think about. What biases might you have due to your embeddedness? And then ethnography often does involve taking interviews with the participants as well. So going to an experience, having that experience, and then interviewing people afterwards is a very common rhythm. There are several types of ethnography we're going to go over. There's autoethnography, and this is where you are the participant and are the object of study as a member of a gaming community or as a player of a game. So you could be analyzing your own experience playing a particular game. Now, I want to note that this is more academically rigorous than a review or a blog or some sort of video journal or streaming even. This is a deeply reflective and often revealing process. It's very scientific in terms of its analysis of your own experience. So it can have elements maybe of those other things, but your job is not to evaluate whether a game is good or bad, whether it was fun or not, for example. You're taking a first-person perspective and viewing yourself as the object of study as you're engaging with the game. And that means that certain things probably need to be filtered out that aren't that relevant, whereas other things might be more important. Duoethnography, you and at least one other researcher are the object of study. So this is where you conduct an ethnography in pairs, although it could also be more than two people. So you place your reflections on that same topic side by side. You compare and contrast your experiences, and having multiple voices and multiple positions in the paper lends to a certain richness of the text. Now, neither of these are better than any of the others, right? They just have different qualities. So an autoethnography lets you go into a lot of depth about one person's perspective, the researcher's perspective, whereas duoethnography allows you to have sort of like the back and forth. Ethnography, this is an ethnography in which data collection and engagement takes place in online environments. This is very common in game studies, although it's not always called this. So you'll sometimes see the term and sometimes not. But if you're studying online gaming in any meaningful way, you're probably doing some version of this. Participant observation ethnography. So this is when you are both the participant in the community and the observer. This is the kind of ethnography I'm most familiar with and I use the most. I do sometimes bring my own personal experience to the work, but for the most part, I'm really interested in how my participants respond to certain things. So I might actually not share my own reflection on the very same thing that they're describing because I want what their experience to be at the foreground. But I'm acknowledging that I am part of this study, right? Like that my perspective is influencing the study in a lot of ways, and that this is a community that is important to me, or a game activity that is important to me. And so when you're a participant observer, you're not just sitting behind and watching, you're actually engaged in some way. Semi-structured interviews are common in participant observation ethnography. Sometimes participants will feel more comfortable engaging with you if you're part of their community. So some people will embed themselves in for a while so that they can start to get interviews. But others might feel really self-conscious if they know someone's studying them. So, there's some ethical concerns here about disclosure and, when to tell people the nature of your involvement. Ideally, you're not just involved in the community to study it. You are also engaged in other ways. Again, stimulated recall could also be interesting here. The interviewer has a shared context for the events as being a participant themselves. So, for example, if I'm interviewing somebody that I know that I've gamed with for a long time, and they're explaining a certain sequence of events, and I was there for that, then I might be able to ask certain follow-up questions, or I might be able to contextualize for the reader what they're talking about in ways that isn't necessarily in the interview. So that can be very helpful. So talking about transcriptions. So as I said, interview data, if you're taking it, it needs to be transcribed in some way. And by transcribed, it means anything that is on video or audio, it needs to be turned into text that can then be analyzed and included in your thesis. Not all of it. but whatever quotes you want to include in the thesis. So if you're doing an interview over email, then it's already transcribed, right? You send people your structured questions and they respond back. Maybe you ask some follow-up questions, but then it's already transcribed. You're not going to get as much data that way, though, because a conversation like this is a lot of text, whereas, but that might be desirable. Maybe you only want a very brief response to your question. So it just depends on what kind of data you want. If you want people to be able to relax and be conversational and to just kind of follow their mind wherever to lead, then it's really nice to do, an in-person or Zoom interview. So it just really depends on what you're going for. So here's the recommended transcription procedure at Uppsala, which I think is pretty effective. So remember that you're not supposed to store this data for very long, for one, and in certain locations. So the idea here is for you to be able to use our online tools that are part of our system, but also to delete, what should be behind an encryption device, for example. So what you'll do is you'll go to Studium and there will be a studio link on the side. And that's sort of your repository. And you can upload your video or your audio there. You can click on it and it will open up a menu and there will be a captions option. And you can request captions in English. This is also possible to do on YouTube, but again, that is, less security that way. So it's just something to think about in terms of your process. It'll take a few minutes for the AI to come up with the transcript or the captions in this case. And then when they become available, you'll request them in English, by the way. You will click on the 3 dots at the top right of the screen. And those 3 dots will bring down a menu that says download transcript. So if you just download the captions themselves, then you'll have all the time codes. And it's very difficult to read them because it's meant for being on video like this. But if you download the transcript, then it takes all of that metadata out, that captioning data. And then you should delete the video from that site immediately after you have the transcript. And then you should listen to the interview again. So you can use, for example, if you have the video on your private device, you can use it that way. But you should read the transcript as you're listening to the interview and then make any corrections where the person's saying something else, but the AI didn't pick it out just right. Also, make sure to note who is speaking when. So if you're asking a question and they're answering it, put your name and their name, etc. Otherwise, it can be very confusing trying to figure out what the context is for these comments. I just want to say that transcription used to be done by hand, and even with a computer, it still required like having to listen to every single word and type it out. It was a very lengthy process. So the fact that these transcription services are very good now is wonderful. It's a wonderful time to be a qualitative researcher, for sure. Okay, so when you're analyzing transcripts and other textual data, you must use quotation marks and a citation whenever including 3 or more words in a row from a source. So if somebody's saying something and you've put 4 words from their quote in there, then it should have quotation marks around it. And that includes your interview data, but it can also include quotes from another book, for example. Otherwise, it's considered plagiarism. So it's really important, quotation marks. You can also paraphrase the text, so you can rephrase what the quote says in your own words. You'll still cite in that case where you're getting the information from. Same with summarizing. So you can give a broad overview of many textual elements. For example, several participants stated that they loved the game, or many scenes of the game included imagery related to water. So you're not going super in depth into one particular thing, but you're kind of broad strokes talking about what's in the text. That's summarizing. So general rules, avoid long block quotes. A block quote is a quote that is more than 3 lines long. And usually they have their own paragraph, so they're sort of set aside from the text. So you don't want a thesis that has block quote after block quote after block quote, whether it's from your interviews or from your research. It needs to be in your own voice as much as possible. That being said, every now and then it's nice to bring in a quote, especially a short quote that sort of punctuates the point that you're trying to make. If you plan to take a big chunk of text and analyze every single sentence, which is what we call thick description, that is an exception, but that's a very rare situation. Usually people plop a bunch of text in because they don't want to have to explain it themselves, or they think that this person is saying it really well, which they often are, but oftentimes it would be better just to summarize in your own words or paraphrase. Exceptions include situations like when the exact wording matters. So for example, if Freud says, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, then those exact words are important to that phrase, right? But when possible, use your own words and synthesize the data rather than including a whole lot of quotes. This is tricky. I mean, I really struggled with this when I first started doing this kind of work, wanting to bring everybody's voice and prioritizing it over my own. But that makes it really hard to read. And it's also really hard to figure out what I think as a researcher and how I interpret what's happening. Because remember, if you drop the quote in and you haven't interpreted it in any meaningful way, which students sometimes do, then you haven't fully worked with the text. So there should be some sort of follow-up where you introduce who's speaking, you put in the quote, and then you interpret it in your own words. You could also quantify the qualitative data. I've done this a couple of times where I might count the number of instances that I notice a specific theme or topic amongst the interview data set. So for example, 4 out of 6 participants said they loved the game. Now, if there's only 6 participants, though, that's not statistically significant in terms of like quantitative standards. So understand that most qualitative studies focus on a small number of interviews or text, and any numbers then that you draw from that are not generalizable. It's exploratory research, as we would call it. That being said, sometimes it can be very interesting. If you interviewed 4 people or 6 people and 4 of them said a certain thing, that could be really interesting. That's a large amount of people in your study. The exception to this in terms of the small sample size are big data studies that use computers to do qualitative coding on massive data sets. So that is definitely possible. I don't know if we have anybody within our supervisory team who knows how to do this. So I don't know that it's necessarily something that we can support, but it is something that is possible. So those are sort of the logistics of how to work with a transcript. But how do you analyze data when you receive it? Or even how do you frame a study to begin with before you even get into data analysis and gathering? You'll see this term in the book that I mentioned, the Game Research Methods book. You'll see this term grounded theory. Personally, I think this concept is overused and it's not very well understood, at least the original intended methodological practice of it. And the idea is that people would go into environments where there hadn't been much research done at all on that particular group. And they didn't really necessarily have a hypothesis or a problem statement or a research question. They just embed themselves in this environment and then see what arises and then start analyzing that and then, further go back into the environment. So it's this very sort of actually structured process. But a lot of people use grounded theory in a way where it's like, I didn't really know what I was doing, so I'm going to go just collect some data and, we'll see what happens. And that's not the kind of method that we would like you to use. We would like in fact, we will have your studies formed by a research question. So we prefer not to use this one because remember, you're going to do your thesis proposal and you will have your research questions and problem statement. Those things can change over time. Let's say you're exploring this topic and you actually find out that you need to tweak some of the language or Maybe it's one thing that you are actually more interested than this other thing. That's okay, but you're still going to base like the interview questions that you make, for example, on your original hypothesis or the theoretical framework or whatnot. So instead, I would recommend you use thematic analysis by Braun and Clark. This is highly recommended. It's very intuitive. I mean, it's kind of the way that we usually organize information. We look for broad themes, and then we, gather people and texts within those themes. And so you can structure your interview questions, like I said, and your data analysis based on very specific concepts. So maybe you want to talk about how much people have emotional affect, i.e. love, with regard to their games. How many people use that sort of emotionally tinged language? And so that's what you're investigating. There's any number of other themes that could be present in that data, but that's the thing that you're really looking for. So then you're pulling that theme, you're coding it. So whenever you see it, you're making note of it, and then you're pulling that data and analyzing it. So coding the data, what does that mean? It means making notes in some way of the places where those themes are present. And just a reminder that you need to save even your transcript coding. You need to save it on an encrypted server of some sort. But if you have that encryption, you can take notes in a digital document. So for example, if you have encryption, you can take notes on a drive, or you can take physical notes on a piece of paper. Like, let's say you print out the interview and then you take notes. I don't recommend that, but some people really prefer that kind of data gathering. And then you will describe the themes throughout your paper. So you'll highlight key quotations when they are highly relevant, but for the most part, you're just describing the themes. Now, this is not the only type of data analysis for qualitative research by any stretch, but I find it very useful. And it doesn't necessarily have to be interviews that you're analyzing through thematic analysis either. It can also be other kinds of texts that you're just looking for certain kinds of themes that you want to pull from the text. Other kinds of data analysis that is qualitative, close readings, also called textual analysis, which is interpreting the narrative, the symbolism, the imagery, maybe even the ideology in the text. So maybe there's a strong thread of patriotism in this particular game, or maybe there's a very feminist bent to another game, or maybe there's a pro-capitalist bent, whatever it is. That's one particular lens you can use to do a close reading. It can be many different things. Formal analysis. So this is where you're looking less at the interpretation of the text itself in terms of the imagery and the narrative and so on, and more at the formal elements that structure the game. So these are the quote unquote building blocks of the game and how they relate to one another. Or formal elements, as we would call them. So these could be mechanics, they could be cutscenes, they could be lots of different kinds of structural elements that are necessary to put a game together. It could be the audio, and you're looking at the way that these things interact with each other. And then we have discourse analysis. So this is another kind of analysis where people are actually analyzing the conversation or the discourse around a particular text. So that could be around a game itself, or it could be around game design in general, or it could be around a very particular subculture. Discourse analysis often emphasizes power dynamics. So it's not just neutral, like it's looking specifically at the way that power is constructed, and who has it and who doesn't within these discourses. So for example, if you're analyzing the discourse of moral panics around the quote unquote dangerous influence of games, which have been around for a long time, these moral panics, especially in certain countries, then you are probably thinking about how power influences these things. So how do these moral panics, for example, influence legislation that influence who can actually access these games, that sort of thing. There's a lot more that could be said about qualitative research, but that's it for now. Again, I'm Lynne Bowman, and here's my email if you want to contact me. Thank you.